All right, mate, we ready to rock and roll?
Ready to rock and roll.
Are you scared?
Always.
That's not it. G'day and welcome back to the Voice of a Veteran podcast. I am here today with our former Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Abbott himself. Tony was a Prime Minister of Australia 2013 to 2015, and I could spend half the podcast sitting here going back through all of your achievements and accolades, Tony, but thank you so much first and foremost for your service to our country and also for coming on here and having a chat with us.
Well, Heston, it's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be with your fellow veterans. But I've got to say that the service that we politicians render is not to be compared for a second with the service that you military personnel render, because while we suffer potential reputational death, we never put our lives on the line the way you guys do. So, look, I was privileged and proud to serve in the Parliament for 25 years. Obviously, it was a wonderful thing to lead the Liberal Party for 6 years and to lead the country for 2. But I take my hat off to anyone who has worn our country's uniform, and in particular to those who have seen active service in theatres of war. So I am in awe of you and your veteran colleagues.
No, we appreciate that, Tony, and particularly during the time that you were Prime Minister, we definitely served, and I myself served overseas during that time. But I'll say to you this, as former Prime Minister yourself, my enemies were in front of me. Most of yours were behind you with knives, and I definitely think you had much more of an adversarial terrain than I ever had to encounter, counterinsurgencies and all.
Look, politics is a pretty dispiriting business, and you're right. You can't always trust the people who are supposed to be your friends and allies, but I dare say in a counterinsurgency war, it's hard to know who are your friends and who are your allies. And I suspect in Afghanistan and elsewhere, the enemy didn't wear a uniform. So you've had to deal with much the same thing.
That's it. But I tell you what, we at least got to prepare for and train and go over and do those things. You have to live with it every single day of your life, and there's no real delineation between inside the wire and outside the wire, is there?
That's the problem with politics. I mean, there are times when I think to myself, I would rather not be bombarded with politics, but you only have to turn on the TV or the radio, and you've only got to pick up a newspaper and it hits you. If you're an ex-footballer, for instance, and for whatever reason you've been retired from the game, there's nothing to make you sit in the stands. But it's pretty hard to avoid politics, even if as a recovering politician, you sometimes think it would be best if you did.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, there's so much I want to dive into this today, Tony. The purpose of this podcast is really for the majority of our listeners who are veterans, and even just anyone at the moment in this climate we're going through, discussing conversations such as loss of purpose, loss of identity, loss of community. And you yourself have gone from being the leader of our nation and through to a number of transitions in your own life. And I really want to dive first into, Tony, that purpose that saw you want to take up the mantle and represent our country and do what you could to not only change our country but change the world, and take us on that journey of that intrinsic purpose that fired you to where you have been.
Well, Heston, I was lucky enough to be educated by the Jesuits, and back in the 1970s, when I was in secondary school, the Jesuits had this mantra, if you like. They wanted all of their youngsters to try to be men for others. The purpose of life was not to get rich. It was not to have fun. It wasn't to indulge yourself. It was to leave the world a better place insofar as you could, by being a good parent, by being a good sibling, by being a good friend, by being a good workmate, and wherever possible, by trying to be your best self. Now, I very much imbibed that. I had a lot of wonderful teachers and a couple of mentors that stayed with me for life from the Jesuits. And so when I left school and went off to university, I certainly wanted to make a difference. I got involved in student politics in my first year at university, started writing because I thought that if you are a conservative in what even then was a radically progressive milieu. You've got to fight the fight of ideas. You can't just run for election. You've got to actually get out there and try to persuade people that some of the, what I thought, crazy notions actually were contrary to common sense and reason. So I started writing. Eventually I became a journalist. Then I became a political staffer. Then when I left staffing, I became an advocate, I guess, working for Australians for Constitutional Monarchy. And then in 1994, I was lucky enough to win a pre-selection to Parliament and spent the next 25 years there. So I had this very strong sense of duty and service, if you like. And no longer being a member of Parliament leaves a big gap in your life, a very big gap in your life. I'm lucky. I was on the old parliamentary pension scheme, so I don't have to go out and scrabble for a living. And as a former Prime Minister, I get an office and a couple of staff, so I'm in an incredibly lucky and privileged position. But the fact is that I am now a spectator on things that I was once a participant in. I'm now an observer rather than an executive,
Yes.
and that can't help but be frustrating.
I can, a smile creeps across my face hearing you say that, Tony, only because, like you say, all the money in the world, all the staff in the world, all this doesn't fill the gap that was that responsibility that you've once had, and you've had that at the pinnacle as a Prime Minister of our nation. And I thoroughly enjoyed your time as our Prime Minister. I fondly remember 2014. I was the adjutant at 2 Commando, where you came out for a breakfast to do some morning PT physical training with us, and you turned up in your green and gold Wallabies jersey, and I'd freshly recovering from a snap patella tendon, but we sat there and we spoke with you, and we had the majority of our forces contributed to Afghanistan. And I myself have really struggled in my progression from the military, just losing my platoon, losing that responsibility to represent our nation, and that's really been a lot for me personally. But you yourself, obviously, you sit here with a smile and fantastic personality. It was just fascinating for us and for those listening to really hear about your transition from that purpose that was leading our country through to what you went through yourself in that transition from that position.
Look, nearly everything ends at some point in time. Obviously, if you're playing rugby, you can't keep playing forever. At some stage, I suppose you can graduate to golden oldies, but you can't play at the same intensity that you do in your 20s and maybe your early 30s. If you're the CEO of BHP or something, eventually you'll have to give it away. So all of these things eventually come to an end, and we just have to accept that. I guess the challenge is to have a sufficient sense of self and a sufficient range of purposeful activities to be able to make the adjustment without too much psychological trauma. Inevitably, there will be a sense of regret. Inevitably, there will be a sense of longing. Inevitably, there will be, I suppose, nostalgia for that which was. I can remember years and years ago, it wasn't all that long ago, it was in 2008, running into Kim Beazley at a conference. Beazley, in my judgment, is probably the most outstanding politician of recent times, never to have become Prime Minister. And I said to Kim, we had dinner together one night, I said, "So, Kim, do you have any advice for me?" I was a somewhat disgruntled mid-ranking opposition frontbencher at the time after the Howard government had lost the election. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, "Never retire."
Yeah. Wow.
And I said, "So you miss it?" And he said, "Every minute of every hour of every day of every week, yes, yeah, I miss it." And that's, I think, the position that so many former politicians, particularly senior ones, find themselves in. But again, you just have to accept that you go into it, eventually you'll come out of it. And you have to be reconciled with these things. Nothing is more inevitable than that every life in politics will end, just as nothing is more inevitable that every life in the armed forces will will eventually change into something different. Now, the great thing about our military is that almost to a man and a woman, our military are very well trained. They're highly capable people. Most of them are very resilient people. I'd reckon there'd be very few former military personnel who couldn't find a very worthwhile place in post-military life. The challenge, I guess, is to manage that transition and not to find the shock of moving from a structured, purposeful life to a less structured, less obviously purposeful life too difficult. And I guess people wouldn't be human if they didn't at times feel a little bit adrift and maybe even a bit lost. But the challenge is to draw on your reserves of self-belief and faith in things that are bigger and better than any individual, to draw on those reserves and help them inspire whatever transition people make.
Yeah, I think the really key point you touched on there, Tony, was that sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
And in particularly for people like yourself, and particularly for those who are suffering the highest risk demographic in our veteran community transitioning, a lot of those transitions or ending of their career or retirement is actually happening before they thought the natural evolution was to occur. You know,
And that's right. I mean, if you're, a fit, strong 30-year-old and suddenly, for whatever reason, you're told that your services in the military are no longer required, that's pretty shattering.
Yeah.
If you transition from being, if you like, a frontline soldier to someone working in the logistics or someone who's not quite as exposed, I guess you're still part of the big family, even if you're not doing quite the same things that you once were, in the same way that I suppose a child becomes a parent, becomes a grandparent.
Yeah.
You don't leave the family, so to speak. So I know that just at the moment there's probably some people in our special forces community who are feeling particularly under stress because of various things that have happened. So I feel for them. I don't want to go into the rights and wrongs of things that have been bandied around in the media, other than to say that all of us have got to strive to live by the best standards, whatever we're doing. But you've still got to feel for people who have suddenly been told that which they had given their life to is no longer for them.
Yes. And
certainly, as someone who's never been shot at, I'm pretty slow to judge those who have.
No, absolutely. I mean, you're right. There's a lot. I don't want to dive into too much of that, but it's just, in particular, that sense of self. And what we found a lot, particularly in the veteran community, I'm keen to hear any parallels with yourself and your own transition, Tony, is that our sense of self is our strongest in service. And we talk about resilience, and I'm backtracking where I was at my best and where I was at my lowest. Resilience was actually that key thing that was missing, because a lot of my resilience in service indeed came from my own personal preparation, but particularly in a leadership position, it then came from the purpose that was the mission, be that serving the nation, be that tactically, and then also the men or the team that I had. And as soon as I transitioned and really lost that sense of identity, that sense of self that was me as a leader, was me as a responsible special forces officer, and lost those layers that had my mindset outside of myself, and essentially the noise came into my own head, and the emotional pain started being my own as opposed to someone else's. It was really fascinating for me to realise that.
And look, doesn't matter what you're doing, it's important to program yourself positively rather than negatively. And all of us have a tendency to talk ourselves down in our heads, whatever we might say to other people. And too many of us, in a sense, program ourselves to fail by just a succession of negative thoughts. Now, plainly, your environment is incredibly important. And anyone who derives a significant sense of self from the work they do is vulnerable the moment that work is no longer there. It's one of the reasons why unemployed people have such a propensity to mental health issues because if there's nothing to get out of bed for every day, if there's nothing to leave the house for every day, if there's nothing to keep you busy every day, is it any wonder that there are problems? And so, this is why going back into my time in public life as a Minister for Employment, I was so keen to get people who had been unemployed for a long period of time doing stuff, even if it was only work for the dole, because it is so much better to be demonstrating to yourself what you can do rather than demonstrating to yourself what you can't do. And one of the things that I've certainly found wonderful throughout my time in public life, or certainly since about 2000, was my service in the Rural Fire Brigade. I mean, you might be a busy minister, but it's very good to be grounded with a group of people who aren't very interested in politics, who aren't particularly impressed by a title, but who you are working with and serving with in something which is unambiguously good for the community.
Yep.
So I've enjoyed every second of my time with the Davidson Rural Fire Brigade, and certainly it was quite fortuitous for me that not that long after being unceremoniously turfed, not just from the Prime Ministership but from the Parliament in May of 2019, I then found myself in the middle of the worst bushfire season New South Wales has ever experienced. And I think over the summer of 2019-20, I spent about 60 days one way or another on the back of a fire truck. And that was, for me, personally, very satisfying thing to be doing, even though obviously you were dealing with what was a dreadful trauma and disaster for the people of New South Wales. But the ability to serve in this way, it's been great for me. And I'm sure there are so many things for former soldiers to do, whether it's the police, whether it's the ambulance.
I think it's just focusing on what you were saying. It's finding that purpose, and in particular, for myself now, even engaging with the veteran community, which I never did before my own downtime. It's finding that ability to be selfless, and the ability to be selfless for others that, like you said, aren't there for rank, title or position. It comes down to tangible and intangible dividends that are on the human and emotional level. And it's fascinating you're saying that throughout from 2000 you were involved with the Rural Fire Service. I'm interested to see how did you balance that with your time within Parliament, noticing that it really was a critical enabler during your transition period?
Yeah. Well, look, it was always, your paid job has got to come first. But, for instance, on total fire ban days, when I was a member of Parliament, I was sometimes able to rearrange my day so that the stuff I had to do with others I would do in the morning, so then in the afternoon you could go up with your fellow fireys to the station and be available for any fire calls that came through. Most of the fire season is in December, January, and January was a downtime for politics. So over the years, even as Prime Minister, I was able to spend a bit of time with the brigade for fires that happened on the weekend, at night, or in that time of the year when even politicians are taking a break.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of the key questions I want to draw out and focus on here is that I happily state that one of the key aspects of you as a person and professional is your authenticity that the Australian people really connect with. I know I particularly connect with that, like you're saying, that the pure authenticity of happy to get out there on the ground and not hold up what others would expect to see from a politician.
But Heston, the last thing I would want to do is put myself on a pedestal. I have all the usual human flaws and failings, and
many people don't admit that though, Tony. Many people will happily sit there and
I'd rather not go into the detail.
No, absolutely, we're not going to do that. We won't do that. That's your own level of authenticity to bear or hold. But just simply acknowledging the fact that we are human. Particularly in today's society, definitely at least this 2020 COVID business, the expectations of aspiration and inspiration, I think, were quite unachievable. And it's all about having those relatable conversations from aspirational, inspirational people like yourself. And even just to hear you say, you are human. We saw that during your prime ministership. I won't go into comments about wearing Speedos and whatnot, but even just that though, Tony, you got to understand, particularly from someone in the military, seeing how much you actually prioritise your own fitness. I'm intrigued as a member of parliament, as a minister, as a prime minister. Does the party have a fitness trainer? Do you have a nutritionist? What focus is there on this outside of personal motivation?
I've always tried to stay physically fit, probably vanity as much as anything else.
Right.
But
the beach body.
But physical fitness is an important part of mental fitness.
Absolutely.
For me, at least. Mm-hmm. And I also found that the more energy you spend, the more energy you've got. And one thing you need at the senior levels of public life is a lot of energy and a lot of mental resilience. Now, getting up at 5 o'clock and riding your bike up and down Red Hill, or getting up at 5 o'clock and flogging yourself in the gym for 45 minutes or an hour may not be everyone's idea of fun. But if you do it, it means that you've got a lot more reserves of mental resilience for the day ahead. And I certainly found, maybe all of us are different in this respect, but I certainly found that it was a very important part of maintaining equilibrium in the midst of an incredibly stressful life. And I figure if I didn't make myself get up and do that fairly vigorous exercise almost every day, I maybe wouldn't have been sleeping. I maybe would have been drinking more. I maybe would have been pill dependent and things like that. Yep. And that's the last thing you want.
No, it's fascinating to hear that because, particularly I get to sit in the corporate space myself these days, and you feel it yourself. The busier we get, usually fitness is the first thing to drop off. But it sounds like one of your core principles has always been your personal fitness, and it's first thing in the morning, is it?
Absolutely, because particularly if you've got a very demanding job, your day can close in on you.
Yeah.
You can say to yourself all you like, well, actually, I'm going to go and go for a run at lunchtime, or I'm going to go and visit the gym after question time, whatever it might be. But 4 times out of 5, something happens and you can't do that. So the only way to make sure 9 times out of 10 it does happen is to say, well, I would otherwise be getting up at 6. Today I'm going to get up at 4:45 so that I get that hour of exercise in.
Brilliant. Prioritising yourself, investing in yourself the first thing of the day. That's so fantastic. I know myself, I don't drink coffee, so I have to go to the gym first thing in the morning. Otherwise I'm sluggish the whole day. But same thing, if I put it off to later in the day, not only might something pop up, but just my own headspace while you're at the gym, there will have been something you're thinking about and you'll be distracted. What is your go-to favourite fitness activity, Tony?
Well, at the moment, I'm doing less and less running, I've got to say, because I noticed once I got past 50, there was a lot more soft tissue injuries. So less running, more cycling.
Okay.
And I try at least once a week to get down to the beach to have a surf, because whether the waves are, big, small, or in between, and if they're big, it can be a bit daunting, but nevertheless, it's just a wonderfully exhilarating pastime.
Do you enjoy working out by yourself or with others?
If I can find people to go to the gym with, that's great.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to go by myself. I've got to say, in more recent times, I've been going to classes in the gym, and
nice.
I think that's pretty good, because you can't goof off if there's someone yelling at you.
We're not talking
to
about
finish the routine.
It's not fluorescent sweatbands.
No, not that stuff. But
gotcha.
There was I shouldn't go into names, but the Dan at Marnica, terrific fellow who used to be the AFP trainer,
circuit training,
was running that, and so I found the circuit training there terrific.
Brilliant. Oh, good to hear. When you're actually in politics, Tony, is there a focus on that, or is it all individually based? So, like, does the party have a fitness plan?
No. Look, politics is one of those things for which there is no formal preparation, no formal training, no formal continuous professional education, nothing. The only thing you might get, if you're lucky, is a bit of mentoring. If you can find more senior people who you trust, who are prepared to take you under their wing.
Gotcha.
And I was lucky enough, I guess, to get a bit of mentoring from John Howard back in the day.
It's a pretty great mentor to have.
I was lucky enough to have some really good friends in the parliamentary ranks over the years, but there's no formal training. Every election will spawn a class of 2019 or a class of 2016. I was a bit of an orphan as I came in a by-election between the 1993 and the 1996 elections. So strictly speaking, I think that made me part of the class of 94. We had one or two dinners, I think, back in the day, and you were encouraged at those dinners to ask questions and so on. But members of parliament are expected to have all the answers, and it's often a bit infra dig for a member of parliament, particularly one who's been there for a bit, to ask too many questions, to admit to too many vulnerabilities or insecurities. So it makes it a particularly lonely occupation in that sense.
Is that a self-imposed expectation, or is that what you've experienced from direct feedback?
Well, as I said, I was probably lucky in that I always had one or two people in the parliament who I felt I could be almost entirely candid with. For most of the time, there were one or two people in the parliament who I felt were soulmates, if you like.
Oh, wow.
So I was pretty lucky, and as well, I've got a group of friends outside the parliament, people who I went to school and university with, people who have been in the cycling group for a long time. The cycling group and the surfing group are kind of a mobile men's shed, if you like.
Yeah, right.
So I've been pretty lucky in that sense, but I do think one of the reasons why a lot of people sense that a lot of their elected representatives are out of touch is because you don't just live in a Canberra bubble, you can easily live in a personal bubble where not much gets shared with anyone other than perhaps, if you've got a good family, your immediate family.
Yeah, absolutely. Spoke about this, the men's shed and this family and support network, and a big thing I have at the moment for the veteran community is really trying to get them together and connect and have these conversations. You can imagine the military, you're on the bus, and then as soon as it's time to transition, it's like jumping out of a moving vehicle and trying to catch up, and your ability to then re-engage with that community and have conversations that are essentially mental fitness sessions and decompressions are very hard to do. And what you just explained is that you've, by the sounds of it, maintained a pretty good support network outside of the workplace that's complemented you personally and professionally and allowed you to do this. Was that always a constant throughout, or is that something you've just appreciated now? Look,
it was a constant throughout, but I suppose there are different times when you appreciate it more. Yeah, I can remember sitting down with the cycling group, many of whom are people who I was at school or university with, the weekend after I had knighted Prince Philip.
Oh, wow.
And a few of them said to me, "Why didn't you ask our advice?"
Oh, dear.
So look, you can have all these wonderful friends, but if you don't make use of them, that's in the end to your detriment.
Absolutely.
But that's the thing. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing, we all need networks of human intimacy.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that you have to be able to tell any one person everything.
Agreed.
But there need to be people with whom collectively
Yep.
you can be as candid as you feel you need to be or can be. I mean, you need to be able to be yourself with people
In different layers, different layers.
And be able to trust
Yeah.
that they are going to respect, understand and accept who and what you are.
Absolutely. And you spoke previously, even just trying to fathom this adversarial terrain that you have to operate in. You could imagine going through the military process, you all go through your training, and then within special forces, it's a year-long training whereby we select the right person and then train them to do what is needed to be done. And it's so insightful even hearing that there is no really professional onboarding course, let alone ongoing career management within politics, let alone support personally during politics and the transition period. It really is quite the Lone Ranger, and
Sure is.
I'm sure along the way you've probably absolutely got to appreciate the true value of true friends, and I'm sure you've also had a lot of others attracted to you for their own purpose. Have you really had to go through that period of making sure you're surrounding yourself with those who are best supporting you? I could imagine, particularly as you achieved early success, you would have been surrounded by a lot of people that probably took up more of your emotional energy than actually supported your professional purpose.
Yeah, look, I think I've always been pretty good at sifting out people who are users from people who are genuine friends.
I don't doubt that, yeah.
There's absolutely no doubt that a lot of people who are, for whatever reason, apparently doing well attract all sorts of hangers-on. And I guess a few of them might turn out to be good people, but many of them don't. And you've got to have a sort of a humbug detector. Which is...
Or a good chief of staff.
Yeah, well, I was lucky in that respect.
Yeah. So, yeah, I could imagine values like, teamwork and integrity. I sit here and listen to be, I knew as a bare minimum I could trust my team. We've been through such common ground. We'll forge with adversity. But particularly operating within your environment, it must have been very difficult, but also very incredible to find those who truly were actually loyal and showed their own personal integrity, and moral courage would have been the key.
Absolutely right. And look, the tougher the sphere in which you're operating, the more readily people can break. And even the best of us can, in important respects, fail. And so you can't be too disappointed when that happens. But I guess it's a question of have people failed or broken in ways that reveal a fundamental character flaw, or have people failed or broken in ways which just reveal a certain basic humanity that all of us are prone to?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Tony, in your own experiences, the reason why we first connected was you actually reached out to me after hearing me on Alan Jones talking about contemplating my own suicide. And there is one phrase that sticks in my head that we spoke about in a previous conversation, was that you went from wanting to and being able to change the world to screaming at the moon. And it's a fantastic analogy because I've found myself in that place, and particularly for me, it was transitioning from where I was really able to provide physical courage and now having to step into what has been the more difficult realm and demonstrate moral courage. And you stand here as a man providing so much insight and experience, but I know personally that actually comes from a place of going through these things yourself personally as opposed to studying these. And your relationship with your own mental health during your time in Parliament and since then, when did you actually finally get fully acquainted and intimate with who you are, what you need, and how it can actually empower you moving forward?
Heston, I think all of us are on a journey, and I don't claim to be an entirely together person. My dad was a wonderful man, and I'm sure till the end of his days he was still learning more about himself and discovering more about the world. So look, I don't claim that I kind of suddenly clicked here or clicked there or had some kind of bolt of blue that made me this or made me that. No, I've just always tried to work things out as best I could. And you're dead right about this moral issue. I mean, I think it was General Slim who famously said years and years ago, moral courage is a far higher and rarer virtue than physical courage. Very true, very true. At the risk of sounding preachy, Heston, one of the other things that I guess I've been blessed with is a level of religious faith. Mm-hmm. I don't claim to be the world's greatest Christian, and I certainly find that my, I suppose, level of comfort waxes and wanes, but familiarity with the scriptures, particularly the New Testament, experience of the sacraments, if you're a Catholic, is, I think, very comforting. Certainly for me, it's been very comforting. And one of the things that makes me worry about the modern world is that, at least in countries like Australia, a level of spiritual knowledge and religious insight, which could have been taken for granted for centuries, is now largely absent. And it's hard not to sometimes think of the level of mental distress as being in some way related to the loss of faith in those higher things which sustained people for so much of our history.
That's it, that higher purpose. Absolutely. I mean, like I said before, my levels of resilience during times requiring physical courage came from that purpose outside of self. And you said it before in a previous conversation with me as well, be that religion, be that patriotism, and I definitely sit here being raised in a Christian household, and I find myself at the moment really sort of starved on that patriotism side of the house. We're launching our campaign looking into Anzac Day and these great monuments we need to bring the Australian people together as a culture. But I'm 100% with you, Tony.
We can get together for the tennis, but we can't get together for Anzac Day.
Watch this space, Tony. That's definitely, with your support, former Prime Minister, that's definitely going to happen. But Tony, you were saying beforehand that there's definitely hasn't been this big click from the blue. Are you saying that you still sometimes have days where you're not feeling?
Of course,
100%.
Of course, I doubt that there would be anyone who doesn't.
But you don't realise, Tony, that not many people of your former position and status and the person you are here today are happy to admit that. There's still this sort of stigma around these things, and it's not saying that you're weak. It's saying that you're bloody human.
Look, I mean, Winston Churchill was famously dogged by depression, greatest democratic statesman of all time, and his black dog, as he called it, would be with him as almost routinely. I mean, if your job is to lift people up and inspire people, the last thing you can do is radiate doubt or confusion. But the fact that you present as confident and sure doesn't mean that you're free of doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important to hear that. We definitely, particularly for those who have purpose that is others, do what needs to be done, but fully acknowledge that behind the scenes there's a lot more going on.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I remember there was a great TV series many years ago based on the Hornblower books.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a wonderful, wonderful little vignette at the end of one of the episodes where Hornblower had gone off to try to rescue this village where the Royalists were resisting the Republicans in revolutionary France. And it was an absolute disaster. The Royalists turned out to be not worth the effort. The Republicans turned out to be brutal and cruel. And Hornblower eventually escapes from the melee with his Marines more or less intact. And he goes to sit down with the captain and basically says, look, this whole thing was a bloody disaster. Why the hell did we do it? And the captain, Captain Pellew, says to young Lieutenant Hornblower, having listened to this lament, he just says to him, never fail to be an inspiration to your men. Yeah. Our job is to turn adversity into opportunity. Yeah. And I'm sure there wouldn't be a single person who does not at times think is this really the right thing to do? But if it is your mission to lift people up and to take them along with you, well, you've just got to stick at it.
Absolutely. It's finding that link to your personal belief to make it happen. Well, Tony, just the last leading on from here is your purpose from here. You are, I know you have a number of things you're going on professionally, personally. You have your family, you have your routine, like you told us beforehand. When we talk about those days we might be struggling, what is that purpose, that intrinsic purpose, that motivation that really fires you forward, that has you dressing so smartly and sitting here talking to someone like me on a day that you might not do anyway?
Heston, you've just got to do whatever you can in whatever circumstances you find yourself. Again, to go back to the Jesuits, be a good parent, a good sibling, a good spouse, a good colleague, and wherever you find the opportunity to make a difference, to make a positive difference, do your best. And where, for whatever reason, you don't quite do your best, you let someone down, maybe sometimes it's impossible to do all people would like, just try to be better the next day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key takeaway my father told me before joining the military was two things: be good at your job and be a good person. The rest will fall into play. And it's been absolutely fantastic sitting here listening to you today, Tony Abbott, to really hear about your own journeys across that way, and also just to be honest and real with where you've been, where you're going, and also just to being a really great friend to our veteran community. I know also, quickly closing out, that you're actually heavily involved with Disaster Relief Australia. I think you're about to go and deploy and support them, and talking about having that purpose and connecting with the community. That's really a great organisation I'm looking to try and push a lot more for our veteran.
Look, yep, I'm looking forward to doing a lot in that space. I mean, obviously I'm on the War Memorial Council, which I guess is a way to help keep the flame aloft, as it were. But yeah, anything I can do to help the veterans, I will. I'm very conscious of the fact that when I was Prime Minister, I put our armed forces in harm's way from time to time. The least I can do is try to show as much support as I can.
Absolutely, and we appreciate that. And we've spoken about this previously. The best thing that can be done for most of our armed forces is actually putting us to work and letting us do our jobs. And honestly, I personally appreciate that from you. And one final takeaway I'd like to harp on here is it's also been fantastic to sit here and listen to a man like yourself present a mindset that is still open and honest and looking forward to learning more about himself and more about the world. You can imagine it's so easy to perhaps sit back and look at someone like you thinking, sort of been there and done it, but you're sitting here with a fresh mind, a sponge ready to go. So
you might retire from a job, but you never retire from life.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Well, Tony Abbott, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate this and really look forward to speaking to you again and seeing your purpose and your mission from here.
Thanks, Heston.
Brilliant.
Thanks for listening to the Voice of a Veteran podcast. We really hope that there were some key takeaways that might help you, be they relatable, be they aspirational, but we're not just here for your entertainment, so please make sure you remember, move on and action from here.
And that's it, guys. If you've heard something here today that has truly helped you, it's our duty to share that information with as many as we can. Support is about being proactive, and that's taking action to better our own lives as well as the lives as many mates as we can.
We love your support getting these messages out, so please subscribe, go to our YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Voice of a Veteran. Catch you next time.
See ya.